Should you go on a short-term mission trip? Hi, welcome to today's little lesson, and thank you so very much for joining me once again. On today's little lesson, I want to talk about something that's very dear to my heart, and that is the subject of missions. Missions are usually looked at within most Christian circles as going to a faraway place, cross-culturally, internationally, although it doesn't have to be. Of course, you could go on a mission to your own neighborhood, and you could go on a mission to another close by city, or you could go on a mission to your own next door neighbor or to your own family members and so forth. But when people speak of mission work, they often speak of, getting on an airplane, heading to another country. And so because we've defined missions as, for the most part, international and cross-cultural ministry, it seems like this might be a good place to begin as we discuss whether or not you should take a short-term mission trip. That is, I'm speaking of internationally, getting on a plane and going to another country, or maybe driving over an international border if you live close enough to one. And the very first thing that comes to my mind when I'm asked that question, should I take a mission trip, is this question: what are you doing for close range missions? Are you taking frequent, close range mission trips? Or another way of saying is, are you doing anything to serve the Lord in some capacity of ministry where you live, in your own Jerusalem? Because you remember, Jesus did tell his disciples, wait for the Holy Spirit, and then you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem. That's where they were, and Judea and Samaria, and even to the uttermost parts here. So there seemed to be somewhat of a progression there, at least a progression in how he said it. And I'm not saying that nobody should ever take an international mission trip, that you got to first reach your more localized region before you take a mission trip. But I am saying that if you haven't ever done anything to try to reach your local geographical area and people that are close by, the short-range missions, then you have to question, what is your motive for taking a longer range international mission trip? Over the years I've taken, I'm going to guesstimate around 100 or more short-term mission trips, anywhere from a week to maybe 3 weeks at the most. And I've traveled in, I think it's something like 80 different countries and ministered in not quite that many, but done a lot of international ministry. And obviously I felt like I had a reason to do it. I was, not just going as a tourist to see tourist sites. I was going to teach, preach, and relieve the sufferings of fellow believers who were victims of natural disasters, or who were refugees, or who were being persecuted or something. And so there was always a reason for going. But in my defense, I have to say that I've always done short-term close-range and long-term close-range mission trips, focused on trying to reach my Jerusalem and those that are in close proximity, because again, it indicates if you're not doing anything to reach those in close proximity, but you're really dedicated to the Lord and you'll go to the people who are a long ways away, you really have to wonder what's really motivating you. Because most people look at a travel to an international country as kind of an exciting thing, go to a different culture where people speak a different language and there's different terrain and you know, a different language spoken and different foods and different sights and you know, it can be kind of an exciting adventure. Nothing wrong with wanting an adventure and going to another country, but just to call that kind of thing a mission trip, you know, is a little bit of self-deception. And so I'm trying to answer the question, should you take an international mission trip? And I'm beginning to answer that question by saying, you ought to first look at your life and say, well, am I doing any ministry at home? Am I, you know, if you're going to go preach the gospel in a foreign country, are you preaching the gospel in your own country, as it were? And if you're not, then I think that's a pretty good indicator that your motive for going to a foreign country is not because you want to serve God and because you want to love your neighbor as yourself. If you're not loving your neighbor as yourself right here, you know, it shows that there's something else driving you besides the love of God. Secondly, and right along those lines, I would also add that, you know, you're about to spend thousands of dollars, either of your money or you're going to have to raise money from your friends and neighbors and relatives and fellow church members in order to go. And it'd be good to ask the question, have I spent any of my own money closer to home, serving people here, making some kind of a sacrifice for people here that requires my money? You know, what have I spent thousands of dollars on before in service to Christ? And if I haven't ever spent thousands of dollars on something in service to Christ on behalf of his kingdom closer to home, how could my motives be pure in saying I'm going to spend thousands of dollars of my money now to go and reach out to people who are in another country? Or again, if you're not spending any of your own money, you should question that. If you're asking everybody else to pay your way overseas. So I hope, you know, your mission trip is going to cost you something. And so whatever amount you're putting in, it's good to ask yourself the question, when have I spent that kind of money before? For the sake of God's kingdom, or for the poor, or whatever, for the least of these. And if I've never spent that kind of money before on anything, then that would show that my motive in spending that much money on this, plus asking your friends to spend their money on this. What if you ever raised money from your friend? What other cause of Christ have you ever asked other people to donate towards? If you've never asked them to donate towards any other cause, you'd have to question your motive as to why I'm asking them to donate to this cause. Why are you suddenly so passionate about raising money? Could it be that be a revelation of what's really going on in your heart, why you really want to go? And so, to sum all that up, I would say, and again, having taken people on mission trips with me quite a few times over the years, looking at those that I'm glad I took them, and looking at those that kind of wish now I hadn't taken them, the ones that I'm glad I took are the ones who it impacted them spiritually. And as a result of them going with me, they've continued to remain involved in ministry, both internationally and closer to home. And those that I kind of think it was kind of a waste of my time to take them and waste of my effort were those that, oh, they had a good time. They will talk about it as a great experience. But when they come home, they're not really impacted by it because they're not continuing to be involved in international ministry, nor are they involved in anything closer to home. And so I got smart enough to where I would never take somebody on an international mission trip with me unless I was certain that they were already involved in some kind of ministry and already stewarding their money for the sake of the kingdom of God closer to home. Because those kinds of people are much more likely to be spiritually impacted and impactful when they go. When they come back, they're liable to be spiritually impactful to others and themselves, to be, all that much more motivated to serve closer to home and internationally. All right, so these, I think, are the most important questions to ask, because there are lots of things you can get involved in internationally that are good causes and so forth. But when you're about to spend thousands of dollars, are you really bringing thousands of dollars worth of value to the people you're serving? And if you're really motivated by serving them, wouldn't it be better to not spend the money on your plane ticket and all your expenses and send the money? If you're motivated by truly wanting to serve them. Now, if you're motivated by, I just want to have an experience, well, then go have an experience. Spend the money on yourself, but don't call it a mission trip. Call it a experience, an adventure. I like to travel internationally. And if you want to do some good things while you're there, great. Still have to question whether it was the best use of the money. All right? Are the people whom you're serving getting the value of what it cost you to go? Some mission trips, and I often see folks like this in airports in the summertime when everyone's off school, and oftentimes they're wearing, kind of the same T-shirt that announces their mission trip. They're going on what they would call service missions, where they're going to build a church building, or it's some kind of a construction project that they're helping poor people in some sense. And again, if 20 people are going and they're all spending $2,000, that's $40,000 just in the expenses of the people going on the mission trip. And then perhaps they've raised money for the construction materials for the church or the school or whatever they're building. And again, kind of some moral, ethical questions come into play. One thing I've learned in well over 4 decades of international ministry is that a lot of well-meaning people who are trying to help others actually hurt them more than they help them by doing for those people what they could and should do for themselves. Sure. Yeah, I mean, those people could probably build a church themselves, couldn't they? If they had the gumption. They all live in houses. They could build a church building that's comparable to the same standard of their houses if they were motivated. But if they think that there's some people coming from a wealthier country who are going to build it for them and supply all the materials, that de-incentivizes them. And it ultimately hurts them because they begin to think that the way to get things is to convince people to come and give them to you. And it creates generational poverty, as it does anywhere. It does that in this country. People that are always given things, it destroys all their incentive. That's why socialism and communism have never historically worked in the entire world. Because it robs people of all incentive, because if they work harder, they don't get anything more. It just helps the lazy people. And so they say, well, why am I going to work for a bunch of lazy people? I'm not going to work. And the productivity goes way down because it doesn't benefit the producers. And so that same principle applies when we do everything for people internationally rather than coming alongside them, maybe to assist them, or better yet, help them realize they can do it all themselves. And they really don't need you to come and do it for them. And so that's something to consider before you think about going on a mission trip. What are we going to do when we get there? And is it going to help or is it going to hurt? Years ago, the ministry that I direct, Heaven's Family, was very much involved in supporting orphanages, mostly in the Southeast Asian nation of Myanmar, often better known as Burma, but in 6 other countries as well, some in Asia, some in Africa. And we had a huge sponsorship program, and people would give $20 a month, and that we would send that to their orphanage where they lived and so forth. But we eventually discovered, through the help of a friend who had also discovered it, that the majority of the orphans in orphanages around the world are not orphans at all. The majority of them, the large majority of them, have either one or both parents still living. All of them have relatives who are still living, who could and should be taking care of them. But by supporting orphanages, unwittingly, we created an incentive for parents to send their kids to the orphanages. And they weren't really orphanages, they were boarding schools. And parents from remote villages in Myanmar would send their little children to orphanages hundreds of miles away so that their kids could be fed and clothed and go to school and graduate from high school and hopefully get a good job. And then they could send the money to the parents in the remote village in their retirement, take care of their parents. So it was really kind of a Social Security plan. And it got so bad that and so lucrative that a couple of things happened in Myanmar, still going on today because of so many Western churches and missions agencies that don't know any better. One of the things that happened is that there began a circuit of recruiters, men who traveled to remote villages trying to persuade parents to let them take their children to the orphanages because their kids would get an education, free education, and be fed 3 meals a day and eat more than just rice and beans was what they were eating. And parents would sign their children over legally to these recruiters. And the recruiters would bring them to the orphanages, and get this, they were paid by the orphanage directors to populate their orphanages because that's how they attracted Western money, because Western Christians have a heart for orphans. And of the hundreds of Bible schools in Myanmar, generally speaking, all of the students were taught that when they graduate, there's 3 things they should do to be successful in Christian ministry: start a church, start a Bible school, and start an orphanage. Those are the 3 secrets to success of Christian ministry in Myanmar. And so it started a vicious cycle. All those things were designed to get money. You can get local people to come to your church, of course. Then if you can get somebody from Australia or America or New Zealand or Germany or the UK to come and speak at your church, then you can introduce them to your orphanage and your Bible school, and you can tell them how great their teaching is. So they'll want to come back, and maybe they can fund a new building or a new dormitory for you, for your Bible school or for your orphanage. And in some cases, it became big business in Myanmar. There were orphanages of hundreds and hundreds of children, all being overseen by really a handful of unqualified staff. Children growing up who had parents and living in other places, psychologically damaged, never experiencing life in a real family, handicapped for life, going on to life then, psychologically oftentimes spiritually and sometimes physically damaged because they were raised in an orphanage, and all because of well-meaning people who supported those orphanages after they visited them. All the time I see, quite frequently, I see people on Facebook saying, oh, here we are on our mission trip. We're all going to the orphanage we all support. And they have no idea what's really going on. And they're sincere and they love the thought of being with those kids and those orphanage directors, being so thankful and thinking that these poor kids would be on the streets otherwise. But, of course, when there are no orphanages, when there are orphans, the relatives take them in, wouldn't you? Brother-in-law, sister-in-law, mom, grandfather, grandmother. Children belong in families. That's where they belong. They don't belong in orphanages. So we changed our whole ministry, although it cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars in support. We decided we would take a different angle and a different tack of ministry, and we began very cautiously and very professionally getting children out of orphanages and back with their families or with their nearest relatives, if it was appropriate. We had to hire trained social workers, and it takes months and months to repatriate or reunite a child with his or her parents, to make sure it's the right decision, to make sure everybody is ready for it, and that's the best decision. But there are standard best practices that we followed and still follow to this day as I'm making this video. And we've reunited, last I heard, over 100 children with their parents. But the orphanage industry is thriving in Myanmar because of what we would call today orphanage tourism. Thankfully, the nation of Australia, which is, of course, nearby to Southeast Asia, put an end to orphanage tourism and actually made it illegal, because legislators in Australia became made aware of what was really going on, and that they're actually creating a market for orphanages by all these tourists continually flying to Australia to visit orphanages. And they made it illegal, because they woke up to the fact that it really wasn't helping those children. It was actually hurting children. It was helping to break up families. There are so many mission projects that are done. And we've learned this from experience, because Heaven's Family, the ministry that I direct, has been at this for about 20 years. So you stumble upon some things in 20 years. But you have to do your research in advance before you do any project, because it's so easy to hurt people that you're trying to help. Oh, there has been a natural disaster. Let's send a boatload full of rice. Sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? We'll ship it, across the ocean. But all the rice growers who survived the natural disaster in the region, you put them out of business, because they can't compete with free rice anymore. And you destroy an economy by bringing in all that free stuff and giving it away. And there's a wonderful book that it's required reading nowadays for any new staff member at Heaven's Family, called When Helping Hurts. And the authors of that book describe case after case where well-meaning people who wanted to do good wound up actually harming the very people they wanted to help, through handouts and through not doing their research sufficiently in advance, not realizing what was really happening or where the real needs actually were. And so I'm glad that eventually I learned those lessons, and Heaven's Family has applied those lessons as we've all learned them together. Okay, so should you go on a short-term mission trip? If you're already doing some ministry and you'd like to expand your horizons, I would say yes, definitely pray about it, especially if it's going to touch your heart, and then you're going to continue to be involved in spreading the gospel to the four corners of the earth and caring for the least of these all over this globe, then it'll be a good investment of your money and other people's money. But if not, then I would caution you strongly against taking an international mission trip, because you'll be held accountable for the money that you used that could have been used for something else. All right? All right. Thanks so much for listening to this little lesson. Hope it helps. If you've never visited heavensfamily.org, that's the word heaven, the letter S, the word family.org, please do, because Heaven's Family exists primarily to expand God's kingdom and care for the least of these. Doing that in about 40 nations of the world today through a wonderful staff of people, experienced staff. And we're getting better at what God's called us to do all the time, because one of our core values is that when we realize that there's a better way, we take the better way. We don't just do what attracts money, because there are things that attract money that really aren't the best things to do. So we try to educate our donors to know what we're doing is the best thing, and if they get involved, it's the best thing. One of the best things we're involved in is agricultural training in 6 nations in East Africa, coupled with a discipleship program where thousands of poor East African subsistence farmers are being lifted from extreme poverty by their own sweat and brains, utilizing the agricultural methods of what we call farming God's way. We didn't think of it ourselves. There's a ministry called Farming God's Way. And within the first harvest, people are doubling and tripling their crop yields. Makes a huge difference in their lives. And then it just gets better from there. And so it's a way of helping people help themselves, lift themselves out of poverty just by educating them. And it costs us about $50 to educate one head of household in Farming God's Way that lifts them from poverty and their children. And of course, that'll have generational effects upon their children as they grow up, as well as their grandchildren and all subsequent generations. So it's really a great, great ministry. And we couple it with disciple-making movements, disciple multiplication movements. And so lots of people are coming to the Lord as a result, and not just coming to the Lord, but following Jesus, real evangelism and discipleship. So if you go to heavensfamily.org and type in Farming God's Way, you'll be able to find a way that you can get involved in that and make a difference for other people for eternity. Okay? All right, until next time, may the Lord continue to bless you.